The banquet welcoming King Duncan to Macbeth's castle is over. Everyone's on their way to bed except for Macbeth, who is on his way to murder his king. En route, he meets his old friend Banquo and Banquo's son Fleance, and then he carries on his way. What are his final thoughts before committing the act of regicide? That's what we find out in Act 2, Scene 1 of Macbeth. Hit like, subscribe to the channel, and you'll find out the next time I post a video on Macbeth here. So Shakespeare chooses to bring Banquo, and this time his son Fleance, back into the action after a few scenes when what we've really seen is Macbeth and Lady Macbeth getting ready to kill the king. And at this moment, in comes Banquo again. It's a reminder to us that, of course, Macbeth, in his attempts to gain power, has not only got to kill King Duncan, but later on he's going to have to think about Banquo as well, because, as we remember, the witches had made prophecies to both Macbeth and Banquo, and they'd said to Banquo that your children shall be kings. And here comes Banquo with his son Fleance. And so that reminds us that, the steps towards getting and maintaining power are not simple or quick. It also gives us an opportunity to compare these two characters, Macbeth and Banquo. They've both spoken to the witches, they've both been given prophecies, and how do they respond to the prophecies they've been given? What's the comparison in the ways they think about the witches' prophecies? And we can see that Banquo is much more moral in his responses to everything, really. We see a nervousness in Banquo's character about the darkness and the lack of stars, while Macbeth and his wife were hoping for a dark night with no stars. So there's an immediate contrast there. And we also see that Banquo is afraid of having bad dreams and wants God to protect him when he says, "Merciful powers, restrain in me the cursed thoughts that nature gives way to in repose." So he's turning to the merciful powers, he's turning to God, and he's saying, restrain in me cursed thoughts, stop me from having cursed or evil thoughts that I might have when I'm asleep. So very, very different and much more moral and a much more good character than Macbeth and his wife, who haven't thought at all in moral terms, but have just thought in terms of evil. In fact, Lady Macbeth has summoned the evil spirits, and Macbeth has got ready to perform a dark act. Whereas Banquo, he wants God to look out for him. So there's that contrast. Immediately afterwards, in comes Macbeth, and he and Banquo start talking. And these are old buddies, they've fought on the battlefield together, they've won famous victories together, but now there's certainly distance between them. Banquo admits that he's been thinking of the weird sisters. He says, "I dreamed last night of the three weird sisters. To you they have showed some truth." And Macbeth responds with, "I think not of them." Another moment of dramatic irony there. We know that he's been thinking about them loads and of the prophecies that they gave him, and that him and his wife have been plotting actively based on those prophecies. And he says, "I think not of them." The audience knows that's untrue, and so we see another example through the dramatic irony of Macbeth's deceptive nature. He's becoming more and more deceptive as the play goes on, and now lying to his old friend. But he can't fully carry out his deception, because he does start to subtly suggest to Banquo that something's going to happen. And he says to him,
"If you shall cleave to my consent when 'tis, it shall make honour for you."
Which means, if you'll listen to my advice when the time comes, or if you'll follow me when the time comes, then you will gain honour. Now, that "when the time comes, when 'tis," he seems to be referring to the time when I'm king. And he's saying, you will get honour. So when I'm in power, I'm going to give honour to you, which could mean, I'll give you a title, I'll give you a lordship, I'll give you greater responsibility, greater status, which the king would have the right to do. So it's a subtle suggestion to Macbeth, hey, I'm going to have power, and that's going to be a good thing for you. But look how Banquo responds. He says, "So I lose none in seeking to augment it, but still keep my bosom franchised and allegiance clear, I shall be counselled." What he's saying is, well, I'll listen to you as long as I'm not going to lose any honour, and as long as I'm going to keep my conscience, my bosom, my heart, my conscience franchised, meaning pure and keep my allegiance loyal. So he's basically saying, I'll listen to you as long as you're not going to make me go down a crooked path. I'll listen to you as long as I can still be morally upright and pure. So there was a little foray into the future between Macbeth and Banquo. Macbeth's like, hey, I'm going to be king and you could benefit from this. And Banquo's like, well, only if I can still remain a morally good guy. So it's a tense moment, it's an awkward moment, and there's a distance and a guardedness between them. And while Macbeth doesn't fully deceive Banquo here, we can see that their old friendship, their old fraternity of the battlefield is really split. Once Banquo and his son Fleance go off, Macbeth gives an instruction to his servant to tell his wife to ring the bell, which we'll come on to later. It's time for Macbeth's second soliloquy. The famous "Is this a dagger which I see before me" soliloquy. Now, this is not a soliloquy in which he's weighing up the options and deciding whether or not to kill the king. No, he's already made up his mind. This is the soliloquy in which he's walking towards the king's chamber to commit the crime. He's preparing for the act of regicide. And this is much more of a night piece soliloquy. Now, we talked about that phrase, a night piece soliloquy, in Act 1, Scene 5. In fact, it was Lady Macbeth who had a night piece soliloquy there when she was calling up the evil spirits, come you spirits that tend on mortal thoughts. A night piece soliloquy is a traditional soliloquy given to a villain as they're on their way to commit a deed of blood, murder. And here we see Macbeth's famous, brilliant night piece soliloquy. So the Jacobean audience, the early modern audience, would be prepared for this kind of speech from a villain. And it's really showing you that, hey, this play is called Macbeth, and the eponymous character Macbeth, he's going to be villainous because he's making these kinds of villainous speeches. The speech can usefully be divided into two parts. First, there's the part where he sees this dagger in front of him and he tries to grab it and he's like, what is this dagger? And then the second part, he's finished with hallucinating the dagger and he's moving towards Duncan and he's having all these visions of dark forces as he moves on with his plan. So we'll deal with the speech in those two parts. So this "is there a dagger" moment is justifiably famous in Shakespeare's work. He's passing along the corridor towards King Duncan's chamber, and there in front of him he sees this vision of this dagger. He tries to grab it, can't grab it, and then he looks again and there's drops of blood coming off it the second time. And he's like, what is this? He's really confused about the provenance of this dagger, you know? What's it doing there? Where did it come from? And so the audience, and in fact, that's what we're largely asking ourselves as he asks these questions of it as well. In fact, he asks 3 questions in the start of this soliloquy. And the fact that the start of the soliloquy is full of questions really shows this uncertainty about what's going on. First of all, he asks, is this a dagger at all? He doesn't even know whether it is or is not. Then he asks, can I hold it? Can I touch it? Is it tangible? And then he asks, is it actually coming from my brain? So there are all these questions about it. And to a modern audience, it clearly seems like this is the hallucination of a man who's a bit mentally unstable and walking to commit a crime. And he has this vision, this hallucinatory vision of, really connected with killing someone. But we mustn't forget that to the Jacobean audience, there would be an alternative reason for it being there. And that would be that for at least some members of the Jacobean audience who would have believed in witches, witches being agents of the devil, witches being evil, they would have believed that it might have been possible for the witches to create this vision, this supernatural thing, this supernatural object floating in the air, and to place it there in front of Macbeth. So do remember that the way we interpret it as a modern audience might not be exactly the same as some Jacobean audience members. So let's think about it in both terms. Let's imagine that it's a hallucination, and let's imagine then that it's been put there by the witches, and let's try and untangle some of the symbolism of this complex object that appears there. Okay, so if it's a hallucination coming, as Macbeth says, from his heat-oppressed brain, heat-oppressed meaning he's feeling the heat and the tension of going off to commit his crime, then why would he be hallucinating that? Well, it's quite interesting that it's kind of out there in front of him, and he says, in fact,
"Thou marshallest me the way that I was going, and such an instrument I was to use."
So he says, "You're showing me the way I was going." That's very interesting, isn't it? Thou marshallest me. You are leading me or guiding me in the direction I was going. Now, he's off to commit a crime, but he sees this thing and he says, "Oh, you're guiding me that way." And he seems to be saying, you're taking me towards this crime. In other words, I don't want to accept responsibility for this horrible crime I'm about to commit. I'm going to place the responsibility outside me in this object. Oh, you are guiding me towards this. Now, psychologists have a term for this kind of behaviour where you place outside of you something that actually you feel within, but it's too disturbing for you to keep within you. So you put it on something else. And psychologists refer to the concept of projection, which is where somebody has these terribly guilty or nasty feelings within them. They can't deal with the fact that they've got these feelings inside of them. So they project them outside of them. A projector is, if you're watching a film in the cinema, if you turn around and look at the back, it's the projector that projects the image onto the screen. And projection is this idea of pushing outside of you onto some object, something you really can't deal with about yourself that is nasty or evil or disturbing or just simply unacceptable. And so psychologists could well see the dagger as this object that Macbeth uses to project his feelings of guilt or his disturbed feelings about what he's going to do outside of himself so that he doesn't feel so responsible. It's also very much a symbol of the guilt that he will feel after committing the crime. The second time he looks at it, there's blood on it. He says,
"I see thee still, and on my blade and dudgeon gouts of blood, which was not so before."
These drops of blood have appeared on the dagger. Now, straight after he commits the crime, he looks at his hands and he sees the blood on them, and that clearly symbolises, literally, he's got blood on his hands, which is an idiom we use in English, isn't it, to suggest that somebody's responsible for a crime, but it also symbolises his guilt. And here, looking at the dagger, seeing the drops of blood coming off the dagger, foreshadows that he's going to have this sense of guilt after the crime. So there's that symbolic significance to it as well. Another thing it clearly symbolises, it's a dagger, it's a weapon, it's an object of violence. And it symbolises this violent path he is choosing to take. He's walking along this route. There is the dagger. It's an object of violence. He's going to be violent. So it's got all those symbolic significances for modern audiences and, for Shakespearean audiences as well. But on top of that, if you're in the Shakespearean audience, remember that it could have been put there by the witches. They could have created this supernatural, ghostly dagger to appear in front of him. And so in that case, what would it symbolise to those Jacobean audience members watching? Well, it's outside of him. It's created by the witches. It's showing him the way to go. And in that sense, if you're a strong believer that Macbeth isn't in fact responsible, that the witches are responsible, they're controlling him, then this dagger hovering there in front of him, marshalling him the way to go, is another piece of evidence that he is somehow being controlled by these dark and evil supernatural forces. Okay, so it's got that sense to it as well, which is subtly different from what we were saying before about him projecting his feelings of responsibility onto external objects. So really interesting. Depending on your perspective, you can interpret it in a range of different ways. And, it's a complex symbol, as with many of the great images in Shakespeare's work. And that's why he continues to be great. You can't just say, oh, that symbolises that. You can say, well, it could be this, it could be that. And he really isn't sure what it signifies, is he? He's like, is it a dagger? And he's like, can I touch it? He's like, is it coming from my brain? So he goes through the questions that we're asking at the same time. Eventually, he comes to the conclusion that it is a hallucination. He says in this short monosyllabic half-line sentence,
there's no such thing.
He's got this kind of cold, clinical ability to stop himself from panicking about it. There's no such thing. And then he says,
it is the bloody business which informs thus to mine eyes.
So he says, it's the fact that I'm about to go and commit an act of blood that means I'm hallucinating this, which to a modern audience, we would say, oh yeah, well done, you've recognised what's really going on here and you've kind of broken through your hallucinatory vision and you've come to understand the true nature of what's going on. So there's a sort of moment where we might feel some kind of I don't know if respect is the right word, but some kind of recognition that Macbeth is not completely out of control here. And that's the end of the dagger section. But it's fascinating to notice that even though Macbeth's gone through this, oh, what's going on? Is it a dagger or is it come from my brain? It's got blood on it. He doesn't stop walking on to commit the crime at that moment. He doesn't panic or freak out and say, no, actually, I'm not doing this. This is messing with my head. He just carries straight on. That's fascinating, isn't it? It's a sign that he's got this kind of killer's coldness to him. He's able to control himself, to rein himself in, and to carry on with his plan. And that's the kind of brutal side of him. So, you know, he's got this kind of doubtful side, but he's able to push on through it. Then we get onto the real night piece part of the soliloquy. He's got rid of the dagger and he's walking on towards the chamber and he starts having these other visions. They're not hallucinations, but he's explaining all of these visions of things that are out there in the dark. And let's go through a few of them because it's fascinating to get an insight into what he's thinking through these images that he comes up with. And first of all, he says,
now o'er the one half world nature seems dead.
Which is a pretty night piece villainous kind of thing to say. Nature seems dead. Of course, to the Jacobeans, it would really make them think, well, yes, nature or natural behaviour is certainly dead because you, Macbeth, are going on to do something unnatural. He's going to kill his cousin, the king. That's unnatural. That goes against the natural ties of family kinship, which he talked about before. So it's an appropriate image, and Jacobeans would immediately recognise that. Yes, nature seems dead. Your natural heart seems to have died somehow. But the images after that are in fact even more interesting in giving an insight into his mind. The next thing he says is,
wicked dreams abuse the curtained sleep.
What a fascinating image. Now, it's a metaphor in which he's saying wicked dreams, so he's personifying dreams as being evil, and he's saying that they abuse, which is quite a strong, violent word, isn't it? A strong word for violence. They abuse the curtained sleep. The curtains are either the curtains around the bed or the curtains of the eyelids. What he's really saying is it's an elaborate metaphor for nightmares invade people's minds, is what he's saying. But in another sense, he is actually walking on towards Duncan's bedroom, where Duncan would have curtains around his bed. And he is actually going to not just abuse, but murder Duncan. So in some sense, he seems to be talking really about himself. Wicked dreams, well, really, he's the wicked man who's going on to not just abuse, but to murder the curtained sleep. So in some sense, this whole metaphor is kind of Macbeth saying, there's wicked dreams out there abusing the curtained sleep, instead of saying, I'm going to do a wicked and violent act to someone who's asleep. He says, wicked dreams abuse sleep. Do you see what he does? It's kind of similar to the dagger, isn't it? He projects his own feelings of responsibility about his crime onto the wicked dreams. They can be responsible instead. As if to sort of say, I'm not the wicked one. The dreams are wicked. I'm not wicked. Right? So again, a psychologist might say this is projection. He doesn't want to take responsibility for his crimes. And that carries on in the following images. The best one, I think, is
withered murder, alarmed by his sentinel the wolf, whose howls his watch, thus with his stealthy pace, with Tarquin's ravishing strides, towards his design moves like a ghost.
Now, it's a very long and complex sentence, but the central idea, if we break it down, is that murder is moving towards its goal like a ghost. That's the kind of central idea. Again, that's a personification of murder as a kind of force that's out there, and it's moving onwards towards what it's going to do like a ghost. That's just like the other image, isn't it? Wicked dreams abuse the curtain sleep. Murder is moving on towards its goal. He's again creating this image of something else that's out there, some other force, murder. He personifies that force. He doesn't say, I am a murderer walking on towards my goal. Again, a psychologist could say this is projection, putting outside of him his feelings of responsibility. And another part of that image, which is really fascinating, is that he says that murder is moving onwards with Tarquin's ravishing strides. Now, if you know your classical history, you would know the famous story of how Tarquin famously raped his hostess, Lucretia. And that's a rape story, which is not what Macbeth is going to do here, but it is a story of physical violence from one person to another. And there are some connections with what Macbeth's going to do, because Tarquin was the guest in Lucretia's house when he committed his crime. And again here, Duncan is the guest in Macbeth's house. We talked about that in our conversation about Act 1, Scene 7, when Macbeth is thinking, shall I commit the crime? I shouldn't do it. He's my guest. Well, now he's going to do it. And this image reminds the audience, oh yes, he's going to commit a crime against the person who he is responsible for in his house. So there's this kind of guest-host relationship that's being broken here. So that's one parallel between Macbeth's case and Tarquin and Lucretia's case. And the other parallel is that Lucretia was well known for being a morally upright, good citizen, a good woman, and Tarquin, he was a drinker, he was a violent man. And so here again we've got this image of Macbeth being like Tarquin, being a violent man, being an immoral man, and King Duncan being like Lucretia, being an upstanding person. But again, Macbeth isn't saying, I'm like Tarquin. He's saying, well, murder is out there like Tarquin. He's not able to accept, he doesn't turn it on himself and say, I'm the bad one here, which is just like his speech in Act 1, Scene 7, his soliloquy, where he was recognising, he was using all these images about how God would blow the horrid deed in every eye, but he wasn't recognising that he was about to do something wrong or something evil. And it's exactly the same here. There's a consistency in his inability to recognise that he is responsible for the evil deed that he's about to perform. And there's also consistency with that soliloquy from Act 1, Scene 7, in that what he does recognise is important for him is that he mustn't get caught. Because in the next part of this soliloquy, he says,
Thou sure and firm set earth, hear not my steps, which way they walk, for fear thy very stones prate of my whereabout.
He says, earth, don't hear my steps. I don't want the stones to talk about where I'm walking. That's the first time in this part of the soliloquy where he said, my steps, my whereabout, where he talks about himself. The other part of the night piece has been, oh, wicked dreams are out there, murder is out there. But when he talks about himself, my steps, my whereabout, he's not talking about, I'm about to do something evil, he's talking about, I might get caught. So just like in that soliloquy in Act 1, Scene 7, he's able to recognise that I don't want to get caught, but he's not able to recognise I'm about to do something wrong. Then the bell rings. That's the agreed sign between him and Lady Macbeth that the scene is set. It's the time for him to commit the murder. And he says, when he hears the bell, he says,
I go, and it is done. The bell invites me.
Again, look at the language there. I go, okay, I'm going to move on, and it is done. He doesn't say, I go and I will kill someone. He uses the passive construction, is done. Again, he's not taking responsibility. He's not accepting agency over what he's about to do. He says instead, it is done. And also, the bell invites me. Again, he personifies the bell as having agency. And the bell saying, come on then. Again, he's kind of saying, it's not my responsibility, it's not my fault. Other things out there are controlling me, are leading me towards this. So it's all consistent. He can't accept responsibility for what he's about to do. The scene ends with another rhyming couplet, as previous scenes have done as well.
The bell invites me, hear it not, Duncan, for it is a knell that summons thee to heaven or to hell.
Knell, hell. The solidity of that rhyme suggests his determination once again. And the scene ends with, Duncan, when you die, you're going to go to heaven or to hell, which is important because it shows the audience that Macbeth is aware that there's a moral order. He's aware that there's a heaven, that there's a hell, right? But his awareness doesn't make him self-aware, doesn't make him realise, I'm doing something hellish. Duncan, when you die, you'll go to heaven or to hell. But it doesn't make him think, am I about to do something hellish that doesn't fit in the right part of the moral order that's going to condemn me? So we'll end our analysis of this scene thinking about, as we have done with other scenes, why Shakespeare has chosen to portray the character in this way. Because of course, ultimately, this character doesn't exist. This is just a creation of Shakespeare's, right? And as a great analyst of literature, your real job is to think about what the writer is really showing us about humanity. And what Shakespeare's showing us here through Macbeth is this fascinating, disturbing, and quite amazing portrait of a killer. This is a man who's not sure about what he's going to do, whether he should do it or not, back in Act 1, Scene 7. Then he's made up his mind, he's moving towards the act, and as he goes towards it, he finds all these ways of putting outside of him the sense of responsibility. I'm sure that psychologists, people involved in court cases from some kind of psychoanalytical perspective, watch this portraiture of Macbeth and think, yes, that is how criminals behave. There's a sort of coldness at their heart. They're able to get through all their feelings of guilt and uncertainty by projecting all of those negative emotions onto things external to them so that they can coldly move forward with their evil plans. That's what Shakespeare really does here. And I think that's why this play continues to fascinate and draw audiences all these centuries later. Yes, Shakespeare was writing in a time when probably the majority of his audience would have thought, oh, that dagger has been placed there by the witches, and watch out, Macbeth, you're in trouble, you're going to lose your soul because the witches have tricked you. But modern audiences are there watching and thinking, yeah, that's exactly how someone who's going to commit a murder might think. And Shakespeare, all those years ago, was able to kind of combine his contemporary audience's beliefs in the power of witchcraft with his own understanding of the human mind in intense situations of pressure and create this brilliant portrait that fascinates both audiences of his day and us.